Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Nostalgia Trap podcast. My name is David Parsons. I really appreciate you listening to the show, and I am excited to bring you the conversation I have today for you. This Ken Burns, Lynn Novick film on the Vietnam War came out in October. I've been watching it along with, I think, a lot of other Americans, although probably not as many Americans as has watched Ken Burns' previous work. But, it's hard for me not to say something about the film because, as many of you know that listen to this show, the Vietnam War is kind of the central focus of my scholarship. I wrote a book called Dangerous Grounds, Anti-War Coffee Houses and Military Dissent in the Vietnam Era, which is available now at Amazon and other fine retailers. But I wanted to talk. I wanted to talk to somebody about this film. Ken Burns has a very particular kind of aesthetic and approach to history. I don't think it would surprise anybody to hear me say that I don't like the film. I think actually, the more I think about it, the more I think of it as just a massive missed opportunity and a disservice actually to the history of the people that lived through the era. I think it's got some good points to it. It's good history, but it's also something that he spends so much time in this film, kind of concentrating on the details of warfare. American veterans, specifically combat veterans, are front and center. And it's not just that he misses stuff. It's not just that he's like, oh, I wish he had a more radical take on the war or something like that. It's more that it's like forest for the trees thing. Like, he tends to spend a lot of time looking at individual battles and the kind of like heroism and the harrowing details of these battles, which are hard to deny how insane they are, the details. But we get kind of lost in those details, and you kind of forget what this whole war is about. And I think that's part of what I and many other Vietnam scholars kind of objected to with this documentary is its approach to history, and it's kind of flattening out and kind of missing the whole meaning of it, which is, shown very, very clearly by the ending of this film. I hate to spoil it for you, but Peter Coyote is the narrator of the film, who's himself a kind of left anti-war figure from that era, and has since been a narrator for many documentaries. I feel like this guy's like the voice of the '60s in some ways. But at the end of the film, Peter Coyote's voice comes on and basically says that, like, and maybe it's not Coyote, maybe it's someone else they have say this, but it very much serves as like the wrap of the whole thing. They said the Vietnam War was a tragedy. It was, undeniable tragedy, but, there's meaning to be drawn from the individual stories of the people that participated in it. And that's it. That's literally their approach. They just want to hear the individual stories and say, well, wasn't that something? And my guest today is someone who has spent a lot of time thinking about the larger meaning of the war. His name is Christian Appy. Many of you maybe know him as one of the foremost scholars of the Vietnam War working today. He's got a number of awesome books on the Vietnam War that have really shaped in many ways, my approach to the war and my attitude towards this history. His first book was developed out of his dissertation. It's called Working Class War, and it's very much an awesome piece of work that he uses social history and a lot of data and evidence to basically unpack the working class nature of the men, and mostly men, that were in combat in Vietnam. And that's a really great kind of contribution to the historiography of the war, because it counters a lot of common misperceptions about the war, but also fills in a lot of great detail. So Working Class War is amazing. And his second book is called Patriots, which is, I think it's called the Patriots, the Vietnam War Remembered from All Sides, which is a collection of oral histories from pretty much everyone you can imagine is interviewed in this book. And that book really, for me, reading that was a big moment, because it kind of showed me, I don't know, the value of looking at the war from kind of a total perspective, at the same time doing that kind of like Burns thing of hearing these individual stories. But the stories that are included in it, including an interview with the wife of Norman Morrison, who's a man who killed himself in front of the Pentagon during the mid 1960s to protest the war. The interview with Norman Morrison's wife is just an incredible piece, and we talk a little bit about that in this interview. So I want to get to the program. Oh, I do want to mention Christian Appy's latest book, which is called American Reckoning, and it's the one that probably goes best with to kind of counter a lot of what I think it'd be a nice thing to read after watching the Ken Burns, is to read American Reckoning, which basically takes on a lot of the kind of major mythologies about the war, how the war's history has been erased, distorted, etc. in the decades since its end, and how the United States never really came to terms with what it did in Vietnam, which is it killed millions of people. It marshaled all of its resources to killing millions of people in Vietnam for no reason, a country that attacked nobody, for, basically its ideological and material purposes. It's for politics. I mean, the Ken Burns movie shows a little bit about, kind of how presidents were involved in that, and the kind of typical tragic story, I guess, of, LBJ getting lost in Vietnam. But it misses kind of the larger kind of implications of what was done to that country. And American Reckoning, Christian Appy's latest book, does a phenomenal job of kind of unpacking all that stuff. So I recommend all of his work. His work really, to me, is I don't even think of it as counter history. I think it's just really a generation of historians, and he's one of them that are coming to terms with this war in a much more honest way and a much more detailed way than just like the kind of stuff that Burns does, which is like, let's look at the war and the combat and kind of how people suffered and all the kind of kick-ass violence that happened. That's there, and that's definitely part of the war, but there's so much, and Vietnam is just such a much bigger and more profound set of events than the Ken Burns film kind of communicates. And so I got to talk to Christian Appy on the phone. This conversation was really great. I think that he has a lot to say, and you can find his stuff. I think he did a set of blogs responding to all the episodes at Process History. But if you Google around, you can find Christian Appy, more from him about Vietnam, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. You can find more Nostalgia Trap episodes at nostalgiatrap.com, and if you want to donate to the show, that would help me a lot. If this is the kind of show that you value, talking about history in detail, left politics, that kind of stuff, go to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap, and you can subscribe to the show and help me out. That would be awesome. So thanks again for listening to the show. This is me talking to Christian Appy about the Ken Burns, Lynn Novick Vietnam War documentary. So yeah, I've been excited to talk to you about this. The Ken Burns, Lynn Novick film is something that I think we've all been kind of anticipating one way or the other for a while, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I wanted to ask you, because I've thought about your work a lot, obviously, but one of the things that strikes me about your work is that you try to come to terms with this idea of like popular memory or public history, or the idea of like how people in America in particular remember the Vietnam War and how they remember history in general. And and Ken Burns is someone who obviously like has this massive voice in popular culture and massive voice in terms of how people think of history. Was that something? I guess prior to this film coming out, what did you think of Ken Burns' work? Had you seen his films before?
I can't say that I had ever been a close follower of his career. I mean, I was aware of his highly productive and long-term and very successful career, but I probably only seen a few of his 30 films, and the one I knew the best probably was The Civil War, which remains, I think, is his sort of most famous film. But so I had to say, sort of low expectations, given concerns I'd had about the films that I had watched. And most of all, I guess that concern was the way in which he has what I regard as a kind of elegiac approach to the past, as opposed to a more historical or critically minded approach. In other words, he evokes and seems intentionally to want to evoke a kind of reverence for the past. And to my mind, it actually serves more to distance us from the critical questions of the past and make them almost less relevant to the present than an approach that continues to kind of scrutinize and challenge the relationship between past and present, and he does it with all kinds of different, editorial decisions, and even some of his great talents serve that purpose. His use of music, his use of photography, and so forth, which we can talk about.
Sure. I mean, it's kind of interesting. I mean, Ken Burns developed an aesthetic that's actually kind of recognizable. This kind of, what you describe as elegiac, like the idea of. The way that he uses voiceovers, the way he uses music, the way he uses. I mean, I think there's a Ken Burns button on Photoshop, which is just kind of like
there is.
zooms.
Yeah, they call it the Ken Burns effect in some of these video software kits, which allow you to not just shoot a still photograph, but to pan it and zoom in and out, which he most famously did, with all those Civil War belt buckles.
Yes, right. And I've watched a few of his movies, and I've even used a few of his clips. And also his brother Rick Burns is a documentarian, and they all have the same kind of tone. And the tone, I think you're right, is kind of like they put history in this place where no matter what happened, whether it was horrific or wonderful, all of it is great because it contributed to where we are today, and it kind of like places it in this. I mean, the one I'm thinking about is the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge, which basically, writes off all this, basically the horrific conditions and deaths that were experienced by hundreds of laborers making the Brooklyn Bridge.
Occasions. Yeah,
right.
Oh my God.
And that history is, they put kind of nice music underneath it, and it all kind of feels like, well, that's the pain that we had to go through to make America, and it's all something to be proud of. And I was really kind of scared that that's what was going to be applied to the Vietnam War with this film, and I think that's kind of how it came across to me. Is that how it came across to you?
Yeah. As a bottom line conclusion, though, I really tried hard as I watched it and wrote these blog articles about it to try to do justice to things that it manages to include that in some ways are more critical than the kind of packaging or framing that they provide, which I agree is pulls most, if not all, of its critical punches. I mean, my sort of joking title for the whole thing is "That Awful War Americans Were So Brave to Fight."
Yeah.
I think that's accurate. They can't avoid the fact that the war itself was by so many measures, a complete disaster. But they'll talk about failures, not defeat, or they'll talk about presidential deceptions, not lies, or they'll talk about the killings at My Lai, not the murders. So it's a kind of habitual choice of language and narrative that just does not come to reach the sort of the more damning conclusions that the damning evidence might really invite.
Right, and I mean, even in the darker moments where I Peter Coyote's voiceover will say something that kind of surprises me with its tone. It's always they always kind of pull it back a little bit, And I was just watching yesterday the episode with My Lai because I wanted to remind myself of how they kind of covered that. And there's a I don't know if you noticed this, but the voiceover says at the end of the My Lai sequence, the voiceover says killing civilians wasn't policy or routine, but it wasn't an aberration either. And I wonder what is what's your reaction to that quote?
Well, it's completely confusing. I mean, it's trying to have it both ways. It's trying to suggest, I think what they want to say is, and I think it would have been more precise, is to say that the killing of civilians was made inevitable by American military policy in Vietnam, but it wasn't inevitable that all American troops would engage in war crimes. In fact, a very small percentage of Americans were active in combat, and of those, certainly not everyone did it. But the rules of engagement for bombing made it very easy to destroy an entire village if there was any evidence whatsoever that anyone in that village was giving material support to the National Liberation Front.
Right. Yeah, I felt like that was such a representative way of a representative moment of how this film kind of grapples with really difficult history, as they kind of split the difference that way. And
the other one, the other obvious way they do it is with their effort at what they would, I'm sure, call fairness or balance, but really creates one after another false equivalency, where they would, the United States would commit a war crime, and then of course the enemy would, or they would, even from the beginning, going back in the first episode, they talked about the brutality of French colonial rule, and then quick to then add, but the Viet Minh were every bit as ruthless.
Yes.
It's
It's Trump's all sides thing. It feels like that there's this like insane imbalance in power, but you don't get that. You don't get that reflected in the film. You get the sense that, and I mean, there's even the moment where they're smart enough to recognize some of this. I feel like during the POW section, they kind of mentioned that many Americans, and certainly the way that Nixon kind of pitched the POWs was that, these were men that were kidnapped by the Vietnamese, and we had gone to war to save them. And it feels like, well, a lot of people that were watching Ken Burns might get these kinds of ideas too.
Yes, right. No, I agree with that. I do think that they know, sort of intentionally did draw back from harder criticisms that they may actually personally, to some degree, share. But they do lavish such extraordinary attention on these American military veterans, speaking of POWs, the story of Hal Kushner, who they keep coming back to again and again. And one of the things that's sort of interesting about his story is that his wife became a bit of an anti-war activist, and it's suggested, but it's not really underlined.
Right.
Her story gets sort of secondary attention, and indeed, that's, since I bring it up, I mean, that's one of my major concerns about the film is its handling of what I guess we have to call the civilian anti-war movement, because the film does include, of course, military veterans, Vietnam veterans, American Vietnam veterans who turn against the war, and handle that pretty interestingly, I think. But there is very little attention. I mean, honestly, as far as I could tell, I watched it very closely, much of it multiple times. Bill Zimmerman is really the only anti-war activist that gets multiple appearances, and he may have said wonderful things that got edited out. I don't know, so it's not to pick on him, but he's on camera. You never hear him make an impassioned critique of the war, why it is so many people, not just of his generation, but from all regions, all ages, all classes, all religious denominations, that created the largest and most vibrant anti-war movement in our history. Why it is that they came and held these fervent commitments against the war. That case is never really made. Instead, he kind of nitpicks various tactical mistakes of the anti-war movement along the way, and then even makes this unbelievable claim that at a certain point in the mid-'60s, the movement turned away from sort of a moral focus to a self-interested focus.
That enraged me when I heard that quote, and I couldn't believe he said that. First of all, that he said it, and then obviously they picked it out of the hours that they spoke with him. They picked that line out. But that just kind of boggled my mind that he would make that argument and they would front load that, because it basically says that something along the lines of that it turned into a self-interested movement, right? That it was all people that were basically just didn't want to go to war and were content to let someone with a high school education do it. And I just thought that was a really, really insidious kind of lie, first of all, but also just repeats a very, very the most common stereotypes and distortions about the anti-war movement.
Right, and then including the assumption, the widely held assumption that anti-war activists routinely or commonly denigrated returning American military veterans, which talk about framing. The last anti-war activist we hear from in the final episode, I think her name is Nancy Bieberman. She gives a kind of tearful apology for referring to Vietnam veterans as baby killers and worse, she says. And that raises a big topic. But as there is Jerry Lemke has written this book, The Spitting Image. Just a little background on that for people who haven't come across it. Lemke was himself a Vietnam veteran who then became a sociologist at I think it's at Holy Cross. and he had started in the 80s hearing all these stories about veterans being spat upon, and it just didn't pass his bullshit detector because it hadn't happened to him, and he just the veterans he knew it didn't happen to, so he decided to study it. And interestingly, he figured, well, if it actually happened at all, or certainly if it happened a lot, I should be able to find newspaper articles or court reports or something from the wartime itself, not just these sort of post-war reflections and oral histories that suggest that it happened or they had heard it happened. And he came up empty. He couldn't find that kind of hard wartime evidence. And he basically came to the conclusion that it never happened, that it was completely a post-war myth that served pretty obvious political functions. That is to say, it demonized the anti-war movement and potentially could demonize any anti-war movement that followed.
Right. I mean, it's part of. I feel like Lemke, the story he tells is part of the quote unquote troops being used as this rhetorical lever to kind of smash any dissent or even any kind of serious discussion about policy. And that's certainly been the mood in this country post Vietnam.
Yeah, even if you don't agree with Lemke that it never happened. I mean, and I'm sort of in that camp. I mean, I'm open to the possibility that every movement includes people who do things you wouldn't necessarily like.
Sure.
There are jerks in every social movement. So
Yep.
it wouldn't shock me to think that there were people who were screaming. I mean, we do know and have on tape, anti-war activists screaming "pigs off campus" or things like that toward police officers in the National Guard. But there was one moment in the film I found very interesting where the what's his name, Marlantes,
yes,
is talking about his homecoming, and he's picked up. He lands at Travis Air Force Base, and his brother comes to pick him up and warns him that there's a demonstration going on outside the base. And so then I'm very curious, what kind of footage are they going to use with this? And they have footage. It presumably is outside Travis Air Force Base, and you do have people carrying signs and moving near cars, but it doesn't quite square with the story that Marlantes told. I mean, he says people to the car started banging on the hood of the car and screaming all kinds of terrible things at him. But the footage, they can't find any footage of that, so they do use a sound effect of something, like hitting a car.
Right.
But the people you're actually seeing, they're kind of smiling, and they don't seem hostile. They're not screaming. Some of them are saying, active duty servicemen against the war.
That's what I
thought. Out leaflets.
That clip you're describing is of the GI movement, I think. Of basically civilian supporters of anti-war GIs, and so and that context is completely lost there. It's just this feeling that this poor veteran had to come home and go through this gauntlet of violence that they don't even really have footage of.
Right.
That's an interesting moment. Your work, your first book was Working Class War, right?
Yep.
Yeah, and you focused on GIs, soldiers, veterans in that book, which is something that has been. We're sitting here, talking about the Ken Burns Lynn Novick film is a film that very much centers front and center the soldier's experience. It seems like was that intentional when you did Working Class War to kind of like start rearranging that story a little bit and start kind of complicating the story of GIs and soldiers, because it seems like that they're kind of the main way that Americans understand this war.
Yeah, though I started it long enough ago. Oddly, this is going to sound weird because when I started in 1981, it didn't seem like there was an enormous amount of attention being paid to American veterans of that war. What little did I know, because it became a tidal wave of attention in Hollywood movies and one book after another, memoirs, novels, and all this, and of course the construction of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in 1982. So it was quickly apparent to me as I was working on that that was my dissertation that became my first book. It became clear that the veterans had moved to the center of American historical consciousness about that war. It really became symbolic of the war and symbolic of a tendency increasingly to focus on the terrible things that the war had done to us as a nation, and particularly our veterans, as opposed to what we had done in and to Vietnam.
Right.
So that I became increasingly conscious of that problem, and so wanted, in writing that book, wanted not to sort of have this kind of quasi-therapeutic healing approach, which I do think carries the day in the Burns Novick documentary,
Mm-hmm.
that sort of focus more healing more than history, and really wanted to recover what the troops went through military training, how they got into the military, and then what they actually did in Vietnam, and the contradictions between their own experience and what the government was saying about the war. Because I thought that was, obviously the far more significant history, and also far more significant to those guys than any kind of hardship that they may have had coming home, which is not to be denied. I mean, I do think that veterans had a very tough go of it coming home, individually without strong government support or programs in place to help them readjust to civilian life, and with from education to employment to health care to all sorts of unmet needs. But the hundreds of thousands who really suffered from all kinds of problems, including war-related psychological trauma, which the film treats only in passing, really had its roots in the experience of the war itself, more than any. So that was sort of my approach in that book.
Well, I mean, I can't recommend that book highly enough. Working Class War, which kind of gets to some of the, the material conditions of going to war, but also the material conditions of making the decision to go to war. And that's something that I thought that the Burns Novick film did not do very well. I mean, one of the things that you do in Working Class Wars, you talk about the kind of matrix or like landscape of choices and possibilities facing young men during this era, and different types of young men depending on their social status, class, race, etc. And in the Burns film, it just feels like all the people are making decisions based on kind of patriotic ideas. And it feels like, can you talk a little bit about that feeling that patriotism was maybe not the number one motivator of soldiers, deciding whether they're going to go or not?
Yeah, I mean, it's I don't want to oversimplify, because I do think that the first thing I'd say is that that generation as a whole, whether you talk about the people that went to Vietnam or did not, was super patriotic, coming of age in the 50s and early 60s. Mm-hmm. So it did shape their consciousness, but I think of it as not the primary ingredient, but something that you would certainly include if even in not in any thorough explanation of why you ended up in the military. You might throw it in, but in particular, it's a very human thing to want to find an affirmative, positive reason to explain your actions. In other words, even if you don't feel you have a real choice about what you're doing in life, you want to feel that you do, and that those choices are based on positive things.
That's
so
right.
What really struck me in interviewing all these guys who went to Vietnam, and many of them were very honest with me. They said, "Look, man, I really didn't have a choice. I didn't feel like I had a choice. I mean, first of all, my parents couldn't afford to send me to college, so I wasn't going to get a student deferment. And everybody in my neighbor on my corner, they knew they were going to go, whether they volunteered or whether they drafted. It was just a matter of time. And and if you went and tried to get a job in some factory where they're going to have to train you, say a good factory, they're going to say, listen, have you done your service yet? Because I don't want to put some draft bait through this training program and have you, and then lose you a month from now."
Yeah, right.
So there are all these economic and cultural factors, and of course the draft itself, which, as you know, was completely class biased in every possible way.
Right.
Channeling working class and poor guys into the military and giving more privileged guys every sort of deferment or exemption to serve, quote unquote, serve the national interest in some other way. So, yeah, I was struck that it was really mostly had a kind of economic and institutional explanation. That is to say, when I say institutional, I mean sort of the draft system. Yep. Yeah. Explanation for the class inequalities in military service, but yeah, the Burns Novick documentary really does give you the impression that all these guys went in under this sort of patriotic glow,
Right.
And I don't think that's
they
true.
don't have the guy that sits there and says, "Well, I was broke and I couldn't afford to pay for another semester at college, and I didn't have a job,
right?
And
or I was going to a junior college and
right.
and I was only half time and working the other half time, and they only gave deferments to full time college students.
Right, and
so I got
medical deferments are the other thing that your book kind of made me aware of, and I think that a lot of people just think of that college was the only way out of this, but there were many ways in which the upper classes had access to ways out of the war.
I'm glad you brought that up, because the medical exemptions actually were more common than student deferments. 3.5 million people got medical exemptions.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about that is you might assume, I certainly would have before I learned about it, that most of the people who would be getting medical exemptions would be people who had less access to regular health care and poor nutrition, poor diet.
Mm-hmm.
That is
right.
to say, it'd probably be people that were on the bottom end of the social.
Yeah, that's what you might predict and expect.
But in practice, it was the guys that knew enough or had the wherewithal to show up at the induction center for the physical with a letter from their family doctor documenting chronic childhood asthma, or even a long list of things that could keep you out if you had that documentation. Skin rashes and flat feet and other issues, or some sports injury that was still causing you problems. And in some of these induction centers, they would just everybody who's got a letter, raise your hand, letter from your doctor, and they kind of got it. They got their exemption, whereas the other guys, as the quotas were going up, the military doctors would pretty much rubber stamp everybody else. I remember interviewing this guy who has an account in my oral history called Patriots. Mm-hmm. His name is George Watkins, and he grew up in this mining community way out in western tip of Virginia, in this town called Big Stone Gap. And he got drafted when he was 18, and he went for his physical, and he had high blood pressure, high enough so that he should have gotten a medical exemption. But instead of just sending him on his way, they decided to keep him there, and kept doing it over and over until they finally got a reading or a blood pressure that was within the bounds.
Wow.
But if the same guy had come in with a letter saying, I have chronic blood pressure, high blood pressure, he would have gotten the exemption. And George Watkins goes off, steps on a landmine in 1968, and loses both of his legs up to his hips, and is blinded, and just had this the most horribly wounded person, veteran I've ever interviewed. Though remarkable guy, amazingly lacking in bitterness. But
that's what I was thinking. Watching so much of this, I think of myself just personally feeling very, very bitter about these things. But they don't really. You don't get that from this film either. You get you get kind of a narrow range, I feel like, of soldier voices in some ways. Yeah, in terms of the pre-war stuff, the stuff like they talked to one guy that went to Canada, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like
but interestingly enough, he too had he was a military deserter, if I remember correctly.
Yes, right.
Not a draft avoider. And he's also the guy that says that, I believe it's the same one, that one of his deepest regrets is that he renounced his American citizenship.
Right,
became a Canadian citizen.
There's always, even when those moments where they share, a story of someone who is anti-war, there's always, this feeling of regret or even like apology for it. That apologizing for the excesses of it. I mean, that seems like something that's very, very common in the kind of public history about the Vietnam War, is this kind of assumption that, well, the anti-war movement, they made some big mistakes and they were, and it's kind of interesting to see that knee-jerk reaction is not there when talking just about the war itself,
right. And as as you point out in your book, there were these amazing efforts of the anti-war movement to cross the boundaries between civilian and military experience, and to make these alliances, and that is totally missing in the film. Though, I was struck in the quite lengthy account of Kent State. Whereas most segments go on, I kind of clocked a bunch of them, and the average of it for a big, significant battle tends not to be more than 3 minutes. But the Kent State sequence goes sort of in and out for well over 10 minutes, and they do. Three veterans talk about how, let's say, American military veterans talk about how powerfully moved they were by the killings at Kent State.
Yes.
And that how it had prompted them actually literally to begin to engage in anti-war activism.
Yeah.
So that signals that could surprise some viewers. Well, wow, I wouldn't have expected, military veterans to be that sort of sympathetic to college protesters. But it doesn't work the other way. They don't interview anybody who's at Kent State, talking about their attitudes about the guys who were in Vietnam. And had they done so, they would have found an interesting thing at schools like that, at least. There were these connections in personal life, and these big, hugely, fastly growing state universities did have a significant number of working class students, and they knew people from their own backgrounds and neighborhoods who had gone to Vietnam. And one guy I know very well, who was one of the 9 students who was wounded, not killed. He was shot in the foot. Tom Grace. His girlfriend had died in Vietnam, and just the week before the Kent State killings, they had gone to a funeral for another Vietnam veteran who had been killed, and who was the best friend of Alan Canfora, another one of the leaders of the Kent State protests. So there are all these intersections, and that the film avoids to focus so heavily on the voices of the veterans and
how they felt about the anti-war movement. Yeah. Even John Musgrave, who at the end of, I think he's the one at the end of the Kent State sequence that they show this kind of shocking photo of him returned from the war, and he has long hair and he has this
that is a very arresting photograph.
Yes.
Because you see him shoulder length curly black hair and a full beard, and he's wearing his combat fatigues with the peace sign on it,
raising his fist,
the whole thing.
The GI movement is kind of is they don't spend a whole lot of time on it, and they don't really get into the confluence between the real civilian anti-war movement and the military anti-war movement. The military anti-war movement is hardly there at all, which is a really it kind of surprised me, considering how important it is to be able to understand how the draft ended and how the military changed, to an all-volunteer system in the years afterwards. A lot of that came out of the kind of difficulty they had in getting soldiers to perform, and that just wasn't there. And even people like Howard Levy, who was a doctor who refused to go to Vietnam and train people as part of what he saw as basically propaganda. And he was court-martialed and served 3 years in prison. They don't talk about him, and that case grew into something which by the time you get to the summer of 1968, the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam, which is one of the largest civilian anti-war organizations in the country, is their official line is they're trying to join forces with American soldiers and end the war that way, and that's just not there at all. There are a lot of shocking omissions, though. I mean, Daniel Ellsberg isn't in here, right?
Right. But just to underline the point you just made, which I completely agree with, though there is, there's some passing references to fragging, that is the intentional attacks of soldiers on officers that were considered to be a danger to their safety or too aggressive. They don't. I was amazed they didn't use any footage from that incredible CBS documentary of the time, The World of Charlie Company, which actually in real, films a mutiny unfolding where a platoon is saying to their officer, "No, we're not going to go down this road. That you're inviting an ambush. We're just not going to go. We're not going to do it." And even that
there's a CBS report of the famous one where the GIs are out in the field and they're smoking pot out of a shotgun. I'm sure you've seen that one. Which is another kind of disturbing indication. And it also, that clip also shows it shows a really brief shot of a base, like I think it's a fire base in Vietnam, where the soldiers had made like a giant peace sign out of the materials of the base. The prominence of anti-war sentiment, and even beyond sentiment, but actual anti-war activism, which came out in a number of different ways, is really not reflected in this film at all. And I thought, that's because it doesn't fit their story. It doesn't fit what they're trying to do, which means that this is, to me, I mean, the film is a really, really distorted history of the Vietnam War.
Yeah, even just you reminded me of the way they handled Jane Fonda. I mean, I'm not at all surprised that she pops up in the film, but it's sort of as you might expect, without any deeper search for what she meant in our American political culture in 70, 71, 72, where in fact she performed in front of these GI audiences in that the entertainment troupe she was a part of, FTA, in front of cheering crowds, quite large crowds of GIs who shared her politics, and I think today we just assume that the vast majority of American soldiers thought she was, Hanoi Jane.
Right. I don't think people understand that, that FTA show that you mentioned is something where in 1971 and 1972, Jane Fonda, Donald Sutherland, and a group of other, actors, performers went around touring U.S. bases here in the United States, and the reception they received was kind of interesting, because on the one hand, the military leadership was really interested in blocking these performances and making it impossible for them to pull them off, but partly because they had a base of civilian support with these GI coffee houses around the country, they were able to hold these performances anyway, and they always held them to like packed houses of GIs that were just going nuts for it, and really, really appreciated that Fonda and her people had like put together a show that was a little I mean, it's not even a really subversive show. It's kind of just like a tongue-in-cheek about like kind of
little anti-war sat and things.
It's really it's fun. To me, it's funny and tragic in some ways, the memory of Jane Fonda and how much she became kind of a stand-in for all these really warped ideas of what the anti-war movement was and what the actual history of the Vietnam War was.
Yeah, we probably should mention that there is this documentary called Sir No Sir.
Yes.
About the GI movement, which has some clips of that entertainment troupe, which is meant to be kind of an alternative to the USO sort of Bob Hope approach to entertaining the troops.
Which Bob Hope was still making like racist jokes and still doing his kind of like really retrograde stuff with girls on stage and everything, and there's a kind of cultural element
Bob
to that
Hope,
too.
Yeah, there was. Though even Bob Hope, shrewd as he was, and knowing his audience, began by 70 and 71 to at least make marijuana jokes to his GI audience.
Yeah,
they would get cut out of the TV version of the Christmas show. But
I think anti-war jokes too, if I remember right. I quoted one. He says something like, "I'm a hawk that's turned into a chicken now," or something like that.
Yeah. No, he did begin to sort of move,
which tells you a lot, right? I mean, that tells you that I mean, the fact that he would change his jokes and recognize that, wow, I got to put some I got to like put some pot material in here maybe make some jokes about the war being wrong. I mean, that kind of indicates to you that the story that Burns is telling is distorted, because it tells you that there was a big change in the way that even American soldiers were thinking about the war that they were involved in. Yeah.
Or even corporate America. There's no indication here at all that people on Wall Street and some of these big businesses were themselves turning against the war. That while it may have been profiting some companies, the chairman of the Bank of America actually testified in 71 before Congress, saying that the war had reduced, not only had it kicked up inflation, which I think is pretty well known, but his bigger concern was that profit margins had declined from 65 to 70. He saw that as war related.
Well, there's the committee to help unsell the war. Is that's happening in the early 70s, I think, where you're starting to see mainstream publications like Newsweek, Time Magazine, Playboy Magazine are starting to run full-page ads by major advertising companies against the war.
Yeah, these are like the guys featured in Mad Men on Madison Avenue.
Right. That's
people
right.
are offering free material, and they did some TV spots that didn't get aired on the big networks much, but they did some interesting billboards and posters and things like that, including one of their better known ones is the old Uncle Sam recruiting poster, "We want you." Well, you have the poster has Uncle Sam and bandaged and bleeding, a wounded veteran with his hand out to the public saying, "We want out."
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's a really effective ad. And it's another thing that I think that the Burns Novick film misses is this idea that anti-war sentiment had become dominant by what probably around the period when Nixon takes over. I think a majority of Americans are seeing the war as wrong and immoral.
Yeah, I think that 68 really is the turning point. But the question, I think by 68, it was the preponderance of anti-war sentiment was still on the kind of pragmatic side. It's not working. It's not worth the cost.
Right.
But by 70, 71, the moral critique is really advancing. I mean, there is this amazing poll in 71 that in which 71% of Americans say the war in Vietnam was a mistake, but more significantly, 58%, so a huge, a clear majority say the war was wrong.
It makes me wonder what those numbers are like now in the years since and how they've changed and how we think of them.
I think they could hardly be I've sort of looked and have not been coming up with much, but I can't imagine that they're anything close to that, at least the moral dimension of it.
Right, because I feel like most Americans are, and I think this is true, that most Americans think that the war in Iraq and Afghanistan were both major strategic mistakes, but you don't really get a sense of morality from that. It's more just kind of like, well, it was a bad idea for us to go in there, but not because it was wrong. From any moral, and that moral stuff, I felt one thing that I wished that had been in the Burns film, and there are a lot of things that I wish had been in there, but the story of Norman Morrison is not there. Norman Morrison, and I did you interview Norman Morrison's wife for Patriots? Yes, yeah, an extraordinary woman, Ann Morrison Welsh, and the name she took when she remarried. He was the guy, just to remind people, and many people do need reminding. Since, when I ask students, honestly, out of 180 students, none of them have heard of Norman Morrison now. He was the Quaker activist who, in November of 1965, went to the Pentagon. He had his one of his very young daughters with him, who he either set aside or somebody came and grabbed her. It's sort of unclear what happened. There's no footage of it, either still photography or any video of it. Mm-hmm. And he did what some 80 Vietnamese, mostly Buddhist, did. He self-immolated himself with gasoline, set himself on fire, killed himself as a protest against the war. And I think something like 7 other Americans sacrificed themselves. And Morrison's was early, right? I think it was like 1965 or 66.
His was, November 65. He had been preceded by 1 or 2 others, but it did briefly get a lot of attention. But
I've showed speaking of how documentaries can be effective. I mean, I've shown the film, Errol Morris's film, The Fog of War, several times in my classes. I show clips because there's kind of extraordinary moments in that movie, and one of them is when McNamara. The film is mainly focuses on the life of Robert S. McNamara. When he talks about Norman Morrison killing himself basically in front of his office, it's kind of an extraordinary moment in the movie because McNamara says, I talked to his wife afterwards, and I realized that he had these Quaker principles. He felt that all war was wrong, and I realized that and this is paraphrasing McNamara, but McNamara essentially said that I felt that I was the same as Norman Morrison, that we were the same. We both felt the same things about morality and about what humanity really was all about, and at the same time we had different positions. This was my job in the State Department and the Defense Department, and that's kind of crazy.
Yeah, it is crazy, especially now. I mean, I do think he is. It's true that he had doubts as early as that very moment in 65 that about whether that the war, he had really thought the war was unwinnable militarily.
Right.
But, he continued to publicly advocate escalation and legitimacy and progress of the war for the, next
and lie about its
3
success
years.
and everything else.
Yeah. But, one other footnote to that Morrison story, which it would have been a great thing for them to talk about over in Vietnam with those people, is that while he's forgotten here, he's still incredibly well remembered there if you're of a certain age.
Right,
I mean, people, when Ann Morrison went to Vietnam for the first time, I think it was about 1999, everyone she was running into knew not only the name of her husband, but knew where they were and what they were doing when they first heard that he had killed himself. Almost the way people remember where they were when John Kennedy was killed.
Right. That's age. Incredible.
And they would cry in front of her about it. And she knew, of course, that he had been used for state propaganda. Here's this American who really is on our side, which isn't quite true because he's a pacifist and doesn't believe in violent revolution. But still, she said to her, she said, it couldn't have been just propaganda that would explain the heartfelt and tearful remembrances that she was encountering. And anyway, there's so many. I mean,
and that's what I think I would have liked to have seen is something, just that brief moment in the Errol Morris. So I do believe that Errol Morris is a better filmmaker, but that brief moment, you don't get anything like that in the Burns Novick film. The idea that that you can tell these stories that kind of indicate the weight of the moral dimension here. You just don't get that.
Right, and part of it too is the kind of static quality of these stories. They're told from within these little bubbles, these little cocoons. You know that he always films people like right in their face, and you can't even see the kind of room they're in.
Right,
and in Vietnam, I mean, it's as if no one lives in these villages, which would still be striking to American viewers that how rudimentary some of these rural villages are. I mean, why not just walk around them with a camera and talk to people in their homes? So you can see their homes, you can see the family shrines to the fallen, and the pictures of all the relatives they died, which they still have, of course. People died in that war.
I actually am kind of shocked that they didn't have that, and I expected a lot more of it. But now, reading about the production of the film, I was kind of shocked to learn that apparently Ken Burns didn't, when they were initially starting the project, they didn't want any Vietnamese voices at all. They were thinking of maybe just entirely an American perspective, which to me is just exactly the opposite direction we need to go if we were ever to kind of achieve that reckoning that you talk about in your latest book.
I think Lynn Novick, talked him into including some Vietnamese voices. But and I also would have it would have been so easy and so refreshing if they'd had some group interviews as opposed to just one at a time. If you had some of these. Even just using some of these American veterans to talk to some younger veterans who had been in Iraq and Afghanistan, which brings us to this whole other omission. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think the word Afghanistan or Iraq is even uttered once in all 18 hours.
No.
I mean, it doesn't appear. So if they want a national discussion of the relevance and the lessons of the Vietnam War, but they don't even utter the most obvious connection.
Yeah, I don't think this film is the basis for a great conversation. Really, the film actually, I think, in a lot of ways, forecloses on the possibility of discussion by framing it this way. I wanted to ask you really quickly about that Vietnamese perspective, because I think of the film Hearts and Minds, which is this classic kind of anti-war film made by Peter Davis in the early 70s. I think it came out in 74. Mm-hmm. And doesn't it, the opening of that film, I've shown it many times in my classes because it really kind of encapsulates the whole story in a lot of ways. But the opening of it is kind of a silent sequence in a Vietnamese village. And you kind of see carriages being pulled by oxes, and you see them using animal labor. You see them pulling water out of wells, and then eventually you see American soldiers with their hyper technology and their weaponry walking through these villages. And the contrast is really obvious, and there's not a voiceover telling you what it means, but you really get the idea that Americans are bringing this incredible technology and firepower into a country that's mostly people that are living very rural. Their technology doesn't compare, and it really you get the lopsidedness of it. And I think that's part of what Burns and Novick's film does not do very well is show you how lopsided this war was.
I agree, and one of the reasons for that is they focus so much attention on ground combat, which they've sort of there's a lot of attention starting the Battle of Appy, and then Ben Jia, and then the Ia Drang, and then Can Tien and Dak To, and then Tet Offensive and Hamburger Hill, all those things, and they so. They're all, you're sort of in a way, the Battle of Hue, that's different because you're in a city, but still you're kind of, it evens the playing field when you're just hearing a lot of combat, at the ground level,
Well, I think that's what I think that you've written about this very eloquently, especially in American Reckoning, your latest book, which is this idea that by focusing, I feel like it's true that the American story of the Vietnam War has whether it be in pop culture or popular history, has focused on ground combat as the kind of main experience. And can you talk a little bit about what that does to the story to focus on ground combat exclusively?
Well, there's two things that immediately come to mind. One is it suggests that the war is really determined by force of arms, and that the combat was really meaningful. And in fact, it wasn't. That was not that's not the reason for the war's outcome, except insofar as that the endless combat did eventually wear down the political will of the Americans, both soldiers and civilians, and the South Vietnamese, both soldiers and civilians, to continue to fight against a still resolute enemy. So it has that significance, but the bigger point is the focus on the ground combat doesn't show the vast disproportions in power and in the killing and the victims, which were of course overwhelmingly civilian.
Right.
So of the 3 million, and that too doesn't
and
really
that's
get,
not that's not a heroic story to tell.
Doesn't get told explicitly. I mean, at the end somewhere, the narrator Peter Coyote says something like, and it is sort of something kind of used a passive construction, and it is thought that 3 million lives may have been lost. Not breaking down into the estimate is that 2 million of them were civilians, and that the vast majority of them were killed by American firepower from these bases all over the place. We see a little. I think there's one scene where you see jets taking off from an aircraft carrier, but you don't see, there's 7 air bases in Thailand. B-52s are flying 12 hours round trip from Guam to drop, 30 tons of bombs each, every day over South Vietnam, 25 miles away from. Yeah,
no
Saigon.
Voice just says that. They never just kind of like lay it out that this was, what this war really was, and that it was, the richest country in the world, marshaling all of its resources to inflicting an insane level of destruction on a country that had attacked no other country. All of those little facts that kind of make you see the story for something more than this kind of like, I don't know. It's almost one of the kind of sickest things I think about when I think about this movie is how it almost makes the Americans should all be proud of the Vietnam War. It almost feels like that's what we should get at the end of it. Is we should all be like, God damn it, it was bad, but we're proud.
Proud of all these Americans. Where do we get such people? A number of people said, where do we find such brave people?
Such extraordinary young men,
Extraordinary young men who went off and did it. And as you alluded to earlier, part of it is the, there are all these different things. The music, too, when you're listening to this classic rock played on top of the combat, you're listening to Jimi Hendrix or you name it, the Rolling Stones, and you're watching combat footage. I've sort of wondered, you can play around with it. You turn the sound off and you listen to this stuff, and it's quite different.
Yeah, no.
There is this kind of, you call this podcast, you call it the nostalgia trap. Is
that's
that what
right.
You call it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they're perfect. I mean, because
that's what that is. Oh, yeah, totally.
That's
totally.
what it is.
And here comes Bob Dylan, here comes, Jimi Hendrix. You're right, but it also, I feel like that, reading the way they use some of these songs, I was again kind of shocked by the placement of them. One of them is like there's a sequence where they talk about kill ratio, and they talk about this one set of battles in which Americans were kind of stunned that they had a 45-to-1 kill ratio, and they kind of realized that, well, that was impossible. That's not something that happens in battle. It's actually because Americans killed so many civilians, and they end up showing a series of pretty brutal shots of basically like killing fields, essentially, where there's just dead bodies everywhere. And as they're showing that, they begin the Bob Dylan song, "Don't Think Twice, It's All Right," which has this kind of tone of like, well, this. I mean, the song is about a broken relationship and kind of moving on with your life after experiencing some sadness. And I thought it was such an insidious moment of saying like, well, shit happens basically, and we move on and we feel sad about it, but we don't get caught thinking about it any deeper than that.
Yeah. Well, to go back to the intentions of the filmmaker, which they have explicitly stated, in public when they've promoted the films at various venues, they both said that, particularly Burns, that they have no political axe to grind. That they really wanted to be as neutral as possible. They felt when they were making it as if they were umpires merely calling balls and strikes.
Is that what historians are?
Yeah. But I think that they're not naive.
Right.
You alluded to this earlier. I think this is just a shrewd effort to reach the largest possible market.
Sure.
And so one of the things they would then also say is that it's possible for there to be lots of truths in war, multiple perspectives, lots of different truths can coexist sort of peacefully and respectfully, and that really what our aim, we do have an aim, our aim is to sort of try to help heal the bitter divisions and polarizations that were born in this war. And that this war, he actually used this word, Burns, that the war, that I'm hoping the documentary can kind of be a vaccine for these divisions.
Oh God, yeah.
So, first of all, I don't think that's possible, but even if it were,
really hubristic
you
as
could
well.
heal these divisions. At what cost? And forgetfulness and avoidance would the cost of that be? And that then he would say, after having announced his neutrality, at these talks, these promotional talks, he would also often, apparently, and I've covered a bunch of these, particularly one at the LBJ Library, he said, there are lots of lessons about the Vietnam War, but the one we all agree upon is that never again should the warriors be blamed. Which, of course, makes this huge assumption that people did blame the warriors for the outcome, which is unfounded.
And that's such an old cliche, too.
So we all agree that that's the lesson, and I want all the veterans to stand up and be acknowledged. So then there's a big applause, that people applaud, and then he says after that, "We made this film for you." So, which is a very telling thing. I mean, if someone who just a minute ago said we're being completely neutral, and now we're actually this is who we're making the film for.
The combatants of one side of the war.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm glad I got to talk to you because it's something that your last book, American Reckoning, which I think grapples with these issues, in a really, really thoughtful way. These, in some ways, I don't think you would be as hubristic to say that you're looking for the vaccine to the Vietnam War, but at the same time, your work has kind of grappled with this idea of like how to, wondering and speculating about how would we move on and how would we come to terms with this war, and it's kind of interesting to think that Burns is and you are both kind of engaged in a similar project. Does that make sense to you at all?
Well, the one thing that, except with a completely different conclusion, I mean, my bottom line would be the one thing that would really would be great to come out of the war. If you had to sort of boil it down to one lesson, it would be that we should get rid of this idea of American exceptionalism.
Right.
I mean, the war proved that we're not a unique force for good in the world, and until we really face up to that, I don't think things are going to fundamentally change, or that our foreign policy is going to become more democratic or more just. Never mind other expressions of other ways of improving democracy. But so I think he is a great believer in American exceptionalism.
Yeah,
I mean, I think that's one thing that holds his films together. He really wants to kind of hang on to that, even in the face of evidence that quite radically contradicts it.
And I wondered how he would be able to pull that off in with the Vietnam War, but it seems like he was. I mean, he presents a story that doesn't really, to me, it doesn't really change anything of the story of the Vietnam War as much as he'd like to introduce a vaccine. He doesn't really change much in terms of our understanding of the war.
No.
In fact, kind of actually shocked by how many cliches and stereotypes, ideas are shared in this work.
And again, I just go back to there are moments in the film that are shockingly close to revealing the dark heart of the whole matter, but then it gets pulled away. I mean, I remember this amazing moment in sort of the middle of this thing where he's talking about this commander named Emerson, who he offered a case of whiskey to anyone in his battalion who would come back with the severed head of a Viet Cong guerrilla. And somebody made good on it and came back and collected the bounty. And in the course of this description, they refer to this Commander Emerson as tough, implacable, brave, this list of things that, here's a guy who
they don't use the word genocidal psychopath.
A huge bribe to commit a war crime.
Right.
They just don't say that. They sort of say he's just a tough guy.
Yeah, and so that in that sense, the film becomes a kind of Rorschach test. Because what's interesting is that the reception of this film, it's all over the place. The right wing hates it. They think that this is another it's another film that puts out these left wing ideas about anti-war ideas, and they hate it. I mean, I don't know if you saw, but the historian Mark Moyer wrote a big kind of editorial piece about it, where he has the usual kind of exceptions to the story. And on the other hand, also, I'd say that both my father and my father-in-law, both of them were born in the late 40s, and they had to come to terms with the Vietnam War. Neither one of them went to the war. Neither one of them were anti-war activists, but both of them have been kind of completely devastated by this film. Because it's brought back memories for them. They both were disgusted by the war, and the film actually just makes them more disgusted with it because they feel the sense of futility and loss of it. So I don't know. It makes me think a lot about kind of as we sit here as two historians that have done some work thinking about Vietnam and all our exceptions to the film. I can't help but wondering how other Americans see it.
Yeah, I mean, it's people who do cultural studies have long been saying, visual and written text of all kinds can't be reduced to a single interpretation. People read these things in a variety of different ways, so we can be hopeful, I guess, that it is better than our own criticisms might suggest.
Yeah, but, I think there's enough material that there you could. I think I think about it would you use this film in your classes if you were teaching?
I already have. I did play a short sequence in. Which I think was actually handled pretty well. It was a battle that mostly involved Vietnamese. That happens fairly early on in the end of '64, Binh Gia, where the striking thing that happens there is early on an American helicopter shot down and 4 Americans are killed, and so the American command orders an entire battalion of South Vietnamese troops to go in and recover the American bodies, and they get ambushed and they end up losing 200 men. And the American helicopter, another one finally arrives, takes away the American dead, but leaves the Vietnamese dead behind. So
right.
It seemed to be a striking kind of
no,
metaphor.
I think with the critical, with a professor that's being careful, you could turn the film into something useful in the classroom, but it would have to be from the perspective of criticizing it a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, the rights. I can see how the right wing would be upset because even though they do interview Lewis sorely and people who believe that the war was a noble cause that should have been fought and could have been won, they don't quite have him say that.
Right.
And they don't have anybody who would sort of give a kind of Noam Chomsky or Daniel Ellsberg critique of the war as an act of imperial aggression, as opposed to this sort of tragic outcome of fateful misunderstandings or however they put it.
Right. Which is in a lot of ways, as much as this film is aiming for something new, it's kind of repeating a lot of the same old stuff.
Right.
Christian Appy, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, David. I appreciate it. Talking to you. It was fun.
Okay. Talk to you soon. Bye bye.
Okay. Take care.
All right, I want to thank my guest, Christian Appy. I had a really great time, as I always do, talking to him. He's got kind of an endless reserve of knowledge about the war, and more than that, for me, he's got a kind of passionate spirit about the war and why its history matters, and he's just so great at communicating that. So I hope you enjoyed this program and this conversation with him. I'd love to have him back on the show to talk more Vietnam stuff, because we don't want to get stuck just talking about Ken Burns. I think that itself is a trap. And if anything is a nostalgia trap, I think that Ken Burns' work, it definitely indicates what I mean by that phrase, which is the kind of idea of being trapped in an endless loop and never learning from history. And I don't think Ken Burns' films help us learn from history. So with that, Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Go to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap to donate to the show if that's something you'd like to do. Otherwise, all the episodes you listen to free. So thanks a lot. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.